Now we will hear from the patient perspective on participating in PSC trials. We will hear from two people, Dr. Lisa Petitcon and from Nathan Buggett. Please.
Hi, my name is Lisa Petitcon. I have a PhD in pharmacology. I have 16 years experience at Merck and Schering-Plough in both regulatory affairs and clinical research. I've spent the last 14 years in hepatology. 9 years ago, my life was pretty good. I was a pharmaceutical executive and raising 2 young boys with my husband. Imagine my surprise when my 11-year-old's labs came back with inflammation in his liver and gut. A quick trip to New York ultimately led to a colonoscopy, an upper endoscopy, a liver biopsy, and labs too numerous to count. Within 4 weeks, my 11-year-old son Alex was diagnosed with Crohn's disease and PSC. Imagine my surprise. I live liver every single day, and I had no idea what PSC was. No problem. Let me just talk to the docs, and we'll figure out how to treat this and get my son better. That's when reality hit. There are no treatments, and there is no cure. Based on the literature I was reading, my son would likely need a liver transplant by the time he was 23. My next hope was clinical research. I searched clinicaltrials.gov and looked for what would be out there for him. There were very few adult studies, and those were mainly single centers, uncontrolled studies, and there was nothing for pediatrics. 9 years later, there is still nothing for pediatric PSCers. I understand, but I cannot accept this. I think back to the days when I was working in chronic hepatitis C, and when parents of children with the disease would ask why the clinical trials for children were delayed. Many of the reasons that we gave focused on metabolism. Children metabolize the drug differently, and a full PK/PD program would have to be done in children before we could move forward. Another was formulation. Children many times cannot handle the same meds that adults can, and a different formulation would have to be developed. A third was benefit-risk ratio. We would have to fully define the benefit-risk ratio in adults before we could move forward with a pediatric development plan. Unfortunately, pediatric PSCers don't have time to wait. We cannot wait for the same program and the same stepwise program for pediatric development. We need to be creative as to how we can move this forward quicker. Some of the suggestions could be for the current adult PSC protocols that are ongoing is to decrease the age to 13. We know that many teens are the same size as adults, and they can metabolize the drug the same. A separate sub-study within the adult program focusing on PK/PD and slower enrollment for these children between 13 and 18 could be put together. We also know formulation would less likely be an issue. We know that these kids, they take a lot of meds and they know how to handle it. The second would be an expanded access program for those children under the age of 13. Those children that have advanced disease have nothing else. By allowing an expanded access program in parallel to phase 3 would give them the opportunity to perhaps benefit from these medications. And then a third, we know that COVID-19 has shown that telemedicine is a good tool. By utilizing telemedicine for PSC trials, both adult and pediatrics would be a good thing. These PSC patients are rare, and most of them do not live in the major metropolitan areas in which the research institutes are. By allowing a principal investigator to enroll a patient who lives somewhere outside of that city would allow the partnership between the local doctor and the PI to have these patients in the study and followed locally. This could improve their quality of life and probably lead to higher compliance rates. We need to think creatively and do something now to somehow bring tomorrow's medications to our children today. We need to figure out the roadblocks and find ways around these, and we need to do this together. Thank you for your time.
Hello, my name is Nathan Baggett. Today, I'd like to share with you how my experiences as a PSC patient, a 3-time transplant recipient, and as a physician researcher at the University of Wisconsin gives me hope about the future of PSC. To begin, I'm going to go back to when my life with PSC began. A little over 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with PSC after living with ulcerative colitis for 2 years. I can't remember the exact words my doctor used when I was diagnosed, but I do remember his message. He said, 1. I had a rare liver disease called primary sclerosing cholangitis. 2. There was no cure or treatment for the disease. And 3. I would likely need a liver transplant one day in order to survive. Hearing the words no cure or treatment sucked the air out of the room. I was devastated. PSC, a disease I had never heard of, had given me what to a 20-year-old sounded like a death sentence. Now, every PSC patient has had a different experience with their diagnosis, but I'm guessing most PSC patients can relate to a similar sense of fear and hopelessness in those first few days. Shortly after my diagnosis, I was seen by a local hepatologist, but unfortunately, he had little to offer, so I sought care at a leading PSC center. There, for the first time, I felt a sense of hope when I learned about the opportunity to participate in clinical trials. In my mind, the uncertainty of the diagnosis made participating in a trial a no-brainer. I hoped that my participation would be a small part of finding a treatment and ultimately a cure for the disease. Being part of a trial felt like doing something rather than just waiting for the natural history of my disease to take its course. But I was lucky. I lived close enough to a major center to be able to participate in a trial. Not all PSC patients have that opportunity. Even with the benefit of proximity, I still had to think carefully about the time commitment for some studies because I was a busy college student, so traveling back and forth for additional appointments, lab draws, or procedures wasn't always realistic. Other studies that asked for patients to undergo a biopsy seemed unreasonable to me because to that point, my routine care had not yet required a biopsy. Over the years, I learned to live with the fear and uncertainty that comes with a diagnosis like PSC. I graduated from college, continued to work as a firefighter and paramedic, met and married my wife, and attended and graduated from medical school. But along the way, I faced an ever-present battle with the symptoms of PSC. I fought recurrent episodes of cholangitis that required hospitalization and antibiotics, and outside the hospital, I was constantly itchy, to the point that my scratching left my arms and legs bloody. I struggled to focus, and it was always difficult to sleep. After years of my symptoms worsening, my journey with PSC culminated 3 years ago when I received a live donor liver transplant for my cousin. Every PSC patient who has required transplantation highlights the need for better treatments to reverse the course and slow the progression of the disease. And my story is no different. Transplantation definitely saved my life, but at an extremely high cost. Since my first transplant, I've undergone 2 additional transplants, spent over 300 days in the hospital, endured 16 surgeries plus countless procedures, and was off work for over 2 years. Even for patients whose transplant goes more smoothly, the physical toll and financial burden of transplantation is evidence that PSC patients need a better option. I hope that one day PSC will no longer be on the list of common indications for transplantation, but that dream will not become a reality without an effective treatment. So what's next? COVID-19 has upended all aspects of our lives. We've learned new phrases like social distancing and let's meet over Zoom. And we've all figured out how to work, learn, and socialize virtually. This strange new normal has extended to my work in clinical research. Our team has spent much of the last 6 months revising our protocols for our clinical trial to shift from 100% in-person enrollment to 100% virtual enrollment. And seeing the ways in which we've been able to adapt to the reality forced upon us by COVID-19 gives me a lot of hope. Just this year, we've seen a 4,000% increase in routine visits for outpatient care at hospitals across the country. And if we can harness the lessons we're learning today about how to deliver care virtually, we can drastically expand the number of patients who have access to clinical trials, reduce the burden of participation, and accelerate the science that will lead to life-saving and life-changing discoveries for PSC patients. For me, the hardest part about living with PSC was feeling helpless. Without an effective treatment, I felt like I was just watching and waiting as my symptoms worsened, I got sicker, and my life was put on hold. But with your help, my goal is that one day, when future generations are diagnosed with PSC, their doctors will be able to deliver a different message than the one I received. Their doctors will hopefully be able to say something like, "I'm very sorry to tell you you have a disease called primary sclerosing cholangitis, but we have an effective treatment that will help you to live a long and healthy life." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Petticone and Dr. Baggett, for sharing both your expertise and those messages of hope. Once again, Dr. James McMurtry will now share the Our Voices survey results on questions, this time relating to clinical trials. Please go ahead, Dr. McMurtry.
I'd like to welcome you back and thank you again for your attention. This is my portion of session 5. The first question that we asked were you ever asked to be in a clinical trial for a new or investigational medication? This had a very strong negative response, with about 75% saying no. Although there have not been many PSC trials, it is a shame that the majority of PSC patients have not been approached to even consider the idea of joining a clinical trial. There is a need for more patient education and awareness regarding clinical trials, especially focused on those patients who are not routinely followed at large medical centers. On the next slide, we'll review the participation in clinical trials and studies. Here we show a response to the question that asks, have you participated in non-medication clinical trials and studies involving registry data, surveys, blood draws, stool samples, imaging, genetic testing, and others? We see that 12% have or are currently participating in non-medication clinical trials. It is positive to see that more than 40% of participants have or are currently involved in registries, surveys, and studies. On the next slide, we review the willingness of patients to participate in clinical trials. When asked, are you willing to participate in any of the following studies? More than half of the survey participants identified a willingness to participate in new tests, surveys, tools to assess quality of life, tools to slow progression or cure PSC, and also interest in symptom management. Most PSC patients are aware of the concerns about liver biopsies, which are not necessarily required for an adult PSCer's diagnosis or treatment. Perhaps identifying a process to analyze the factors in the complex issues surrounding liver biopsies in clinical trials, and including the voice of the patient, could reduce or remove a barrier to future clinical trials. Overall, we see that many PSCers have expressed a great willingness to participate in clinical trials. On the next slide, we review the information from a prior PSC partner survey that identified patient-reported concerns about joining a clinical trial. In this survey, we identified, asked 19 previously reported concerns and asked the participants to rank their top 5. You're seeing the most frequently selected. Unknown side effects and the possibility the drug may affect current treatments was chosen most frequently, followed by difficulty communicating with the clinical team. Liver biopsies were again noted as a concern. Other concerns include fear of jeopardizing my current health, lack of access to my study results, and time to travel to a medical center. Again, questions remain. What are the best ways to help reduce patient concerns? Of note, one of the most highly ranked concerns, communication, is likely something that is easier to address than others. please consider using PSC partners as a resource in communication. Other questions include, will greater awareness of patient concerns promote proactive education, discussion, and patient knowledge? Will this lead to access to researchers, industry, and support staff to address concerns and increase participation? And will clinical trial protocols developed or revised as a result of the current pandemic increase or decrease participation in these studies? Certainly, insight will be available from more intense analysis of the 40-question Our Voices survey, and we invite the audience to connect with us to learn more. I'd again like to thank you for asking me to talk and for your attention today. And with this, I'll turn my section back over to the moderator. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. McMurtry. We will now turn once again to live polling, and this is the last set of polling questions for the day. Again, please participate in the polling only if you are a PSC patient or a caregiver. To get to the polling, find the live polling tab at the bottom of the page under the live stream window, or pick up your phone and go directly to pollev.com/PFDD, PSC PFDD. For this first question, with COVID-19, we've seen ways in which the world can change fast and ways the world has adapted. As our previous speakers both alluded to, with respect to clinical trials, we've seen the feasibility of changes to some aspects of clinical trial practices that could reduce burdens of participation on patients. So with that in mind, please respond to the question, what would make clinical trials more patient-centric and doable? Select all that apply. A, use of telemedicine as much as possible. B, home health nursing visits when appropriate. C, home blood draws. D, stool or saliva sample by mail. E, home medication delivery. Or F, informed consent done online versus office. Not surprisingly, everybody likes use of telemedicine as much as possible.
Right. It's amazing, isn't it, how one of the side effects of COVID, an unanticipated benefit, I guess we could say, is that we are all getting so much more used to doing things remotely. And so that telemedicine is no longer such an unusual idea.
Yep, not such a crazy ask.
Right.
So I think that the responses are saying we are asking to please use them as much as possible.
Right.
Can we go to question 2, please? This next question is about patient willingness to contribute data to a natural history study. Before you answer, some background on how a natural history study is different from a patient registry. PSC Partners, as you've heard, has a robust patient registry. The registry collects patient-reported, standardized information about the registry participants and has many powerful uses. A natural history study is more comprehensive and includes medical data as well as patient-reported data, and helps us to learn more about the natural history of the disease. For serious rare diseases with unmet medical need, such as PSC, a natural history study may be used as an external control in a trial, that is, as evidence to replace a control arm, the placebo group, in certain types of clinical trials, and if the data is collected in a way that is acceptable to regulators. We anticipate that a natural history study intended for such use would need to include medical records, in addition to patient-reported data. So the question is, if full privacy protections are in place, are you willing to contribute your health information to a natural history study? Please select one. Wow, 97%.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
Not a single no. Not a single
no. A few maybes, and I imagine everybody would want to know more about what that full privacy protections mean.
Right, right. And it's so important to also realize that if we have such a natural history study, it means we use the patient populations available for a clinical trial, especially in a rare disease, much more efficiently.
Absolutely. The next question, in fact, is on that topic. Can we go to the next question? Would you want this de-identified natural history data to be shared with screened and approved academic researchers and drug developers to accelerate drug development? And the idea is obviously we could use the same information more than once. Please
This is
select one,
amazing.
100%.
100%. We couldn't have ended on a more positive note. I think the message is very clear. The message is just so very clear coming out of this poll.
Thank you so much to everybody who has participated in the polling throughout the day. The results of all of the polling will be made available as part of the Voice of the Patient report, so please stay tuned for that.